Hi. Thank you. Wake up. It's 2 o'clock. I sometimes have a 2 o'clock class and my students are like, oh, they have this look on their face like, how could you make me suffer through a 2 o'clock anything? But this is actually a decent spot for this conversation. I'll just jump in. There are a couple of ways I could come at this. I could speak from the perspective of a journalist and a professor, which is my day job and an area where I feel more or less at ease. I could alternatively come at this as a memoirist, which I've also been at times, and while that's a hat I wear less often, it makes the task of telling you about my own experience writing about mental health a little more straightforward and a lot less risque. Or I could come at this as an expert by experience, to use the pleasantly patrician term currently in favor among the experts who call themselves experts. Less euphemistically, I'd be called a patient, since I have a diagnosis of major mental illness and have spent my fair share of time in psychiatric care. But for starters, I'm just going to tell you about Christy. In 1999, when Christy Furness was 26, she walked down the hall of the psych ward at Minneapolis's Abbott Northwestern Hospital, known nationally for its exceptional cardiac center and local for the nightmare conditions on its psych ward, and stopped at the nursing station to take the Dixie cup of meds handed to her by the harried nurse. She had no diagnosis yet and no idea what pills she was swallowing. In fact, she had no clue what was going on. What she did have was a question. She waited until the nurse looked up and asked her what the problem was. Christy then asked politely, is this thing gonna go away? The nurse hesitated. Christy watched as her face turned gentle and kind, the kind of expression that says, you poor thing. After a long pause, the nurse offered, well, it may get more manageable. So, said Christy, who's a very funny woman, nodding, you mean I'll get used to it. Telling me this story years later, Christy said, so when the doctors were like, oh, yay, we know what you have now. You have schizophrenia. I was like, oh, yay, well, fuck that. But why even tell you about Christy? Is Christy the news peg? Is Christy the human face of mental illness? The stereotype that illustrates the whole? Is she my anecdotal human interest lead? The springboard from which I launch my big issue story, which hopefully this time says something new? Why else get the patient's point of view, if not as a means to a larger end? I am not a quantitative research scientist or a computational psychiatrist or a person to whom big data makes any sense at all. For that reason, I really don't know how many times I've read articles about mental illness that use not a single expert by experience, not a single mental health consumer, not a single psychiatric patient as a source. I have lost count of the number of articles I have read in which the reporter has satisfied her or himself by consulting experts and authorities in the field and found it unnecessary to get the perspective of those who are most directly, intimately, and immediately affected by mental illness and its social costs, people who are in fact mentally ill. But any rational editor or devil's advocate would ask, are they reliable sources? Are they informed about the issues? Do they know of what they speak? Or do we doubt them before they begin? Is their story suspect right out of the gate? Do we trust their version of the facts, their interpretation of events, their perception of reality at all? Are they on or off their meds? Did they comply with relevant orders? Are they well-heeled, well-educated, well-behaved? Some are, some aren't. But they do know a thing or two. They know how often the word burden is used to describe them in the news. They know how disproportionately they are mentioned in the same article as the words shooter and gun instead of the words victim and crime. And they know how often, or rarely, we shed any light at all on the concerns that ruled their lives. Like a lot of issues with a capital I, mental illness goes through a pretty regular news cycle, moving in and out of the public eye with relative speed and ease, combining a bit of gritty detail with that power of the human spirit spin. There is a persistent fallacy that believes that if we could only grasp the plight of the mentally ill, generally speaking, en masse, we would be more sensitive or more understanding or at least more aware, but it is never clear what we would do exactly if we were more aware, or even what we are to be more aware of. Whether or not it is the place of journalists to actively seek to drive social change remains open to debate. But frustration with the media coverage of mental health is common to both people who work in the mental health field and people who cover this beat. While the factors feeding that frustration are manifold, at least one of them is easy to identify and can be pretty easily addressed. There is a long-standing and dangerous construct embedded in both mental health care and in mental health journalism, and that is the distance we maintain between us and them. Both journalists and experts in the field feel the right to speak for, if not over, people who know mental illness firsthand, as if they have nothing to say, as if they are not actually the authority on their own minds and lives. The catchphrase of the mental health recovery movement of the 60s and 70s was, "Nothing about us without us." But most of what is written about us is indeed written without us, just as most of what is decided about us, both at the clinical level and at the sociopolitical one, is actually decided for us, without our input, often without our knowledge or our informed consent. A few years back, People magazine called me to ask if Britney Spears had bipolar. They said she had shaved her head and was having shenanigans. I said I had not met Britney Spears and anyway was not a mental health professional and was not in the business of handing out armchair diagnoses. Also, I said it seemed to me that a pop star having shenanigans was neither indicative of mental illness nor really breaking news. The reporter asked me if I knew any experts who might be willing to attest that Britney Spears had bipolar. I said she should probably start with Britney Spears. I met Carol on a scraggly post-conference Sunday in a 2-star Newark Airport hotel bar. We'd both been attending the national meeting of the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, and now we're among a handful of conference goers killing time while we waited for the shuttle to carry us back to our workaday lives. I was vaguely listening to the chatter and chewing on my straw when Carol, to my left, sort of leaned into my shoulder and said in a sweet southern drawl, "You know, I just think he got tired of being alive. You know that? I think he was tired." Her brown eyes softened into tears, which she either didn't notice or didn't mind, just blinked them off her lashes and let them fall onto her skirt. Carol and I had not exactly met. She took a breath, let it out with an apologetic laugh. "My son," she said by way of explanation, "he completed suicide last year." "I'm so sorry," I said, not knowing where to begin. "I know," she said, "so am I." Carol and I parted ways that Sunday evening in Newark, but kept in touch. 2 months later, I flew to Nashville to hear what she had to say. She picked me up at the airport, a study in style, tanned, coiffed, a jangle with silver jewelry. She was impeccable, invincible, the picture of calm. I jogged to keep up with her as she zipped through the airport, threw my bag into the back of her tiny black sports car, swung into the driver's seat, put on her sunglasses, barreled out of the parking lot, and started to talk. "I am so in the process of reinventing myself right now," she said breezily. "I'm a serial volunteer. My husband asks me, 'What acronym are you going to today, Carol?' I have DBSA, the TSPN, the ASPF, NAMI. I'm on the Committee for Suicide Prevention in the African American Faith Committee. I'm on the 10 Care Select Behavioral something committee. I'm doing SOS, Survivors of Suicide Loss. And I'm still doing my hospice, and I'm going to this Bible study with these fab ladies, so I'm starting to do things, and I'm okay. I'm okay. I am frozen feelings unfreezing. I am sometimes hysterically on the floor." She paused, as if confused. We drove past the Loveless Motel. "I dealt with a very sick child for a very long time," Carol said then, her voice even. "I was stressed, there was strife, and I never had a break. And then I did have a break." I met Carol in 2013, just as I was starting my 6th book, a book that was sparked by a hot-button item that kept popping up on my newsfeed that spring. The condition of our modern mental health was cornering a sizable chunk of real estate in the mainstream news. One May morning, I noticed a headline on the subject prominently featured in the New York Times. It said, "Psychiatry's guide is out of touch with science, experts say." The New York Times reporter wrote that the DSM-5 had, quote, "stirred unprecedented questioning from the public, patient groups, and, most fundamentally, senior figures in psychiatry, who have challenged not only decisions about specific diagnoses, but the scientific basis of the entire enterprise. Basic research into the biology of mental disorders and treatment has stalled, they say, confounded by the labyrinth of the brain." There were a whole lot of problems with this statement, as there were and are with the DSM itself. What I found myself wondering was this: why was the critique by senior figures in the field the most fundamental? What about the concerns of the public, to say nothing of those unnamed, breezed-by patient groups? The article would have benefited from a few sources outside the extremely rarefied world of research science had the reporter gone to his local mental health drop-in center and asked anyone there what they thought of the DSM. They'd have given him an earful. And had those experts been consulted, the coverage of the debate might have been, instead of a largely academic exercise, a serious consideration of the problems facing the field. But neuroscience is sexy, as news pegs go, in a way mental illness distinctly is not. So it wasn't, in fact, a sudden, unprecedented, high-level concern for people's mental health that was making media waves. It was a fascination with new and sophisticated science, science that promised to tease out the secrets of the human mind. I was as swept away by the news of spring 2013 as any other science-reading nerd, and I suspected that the hubbub about the DSM might be about something larger, something that might eventually have serious repercussions for millions of people, including me. My initial idea was that there was an article to be written. I thought I'd write about the neuroscience and use glossy terms like cutting-edge technology and proclaim that we are on the verge of some breathtaking discovery or new understanding or radical insight, etc., etc., etc. I would put a human face on the scientists and show that under their floof of Einstein hair, they were actually very ordinary people like you and me. Or I thought I'd interview a few of the headline-nabbing famous psychiatrists and juxtapose their points of view with the much more common experiences of psychiatrists on the ground, many of whom are staggering under vastly overgrown caseloads, racing to keep up with an overwhelming demand, practicing palliative medicine in facilities with too few employees and dwindling financial means. Or I would write about the criminal negligence of U.S. health insurance companies to cover appropriate medical care for people with mental illness. Or I would write about the retrogressive social policies that create the poverty and lack of stable housing that cuts millions of people with mental illness off from any health care at all. Or I would write about the money we spend each year by not treating mental illness and the literally billions we'd save each year by putting a few fairly cheap services and supports into place. But none of that is sexy, so I went back to the neuroscience. And if that was really the only or the most pressing story around right now, that's what my next book would be about. But it's not. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in an airport, my brain filled with the clutter and junk of a long travel day, thinking about what this all might mean in human terms, and I thought suddenly, where in all this uproar is the patient's voice? And that question has, over the years I've spent researching these subjects, unfolded endlessly into other questions about psychiatry, about science, about ethics, about institutions, corporations, and money, about politics, perception, stigma, social policy, and ultimately, most importantly, about people's lives. I started researching where I expect most journalists would. I went to the experts. I spoke to physicians, scientists, researchers, professors, executives, public health officials, political figures, advocates, and everything in between. My question for them was fairly straightforward. What makes people better, I asked. What helps people heal? The experts had a lot to say. They told me more than I could or perhaps should ever fit into a book. I learned an extraordinary amount. But every time I asked them essentially, again, how do people with mental illness succeed? They couldn't answer me. So I had to go to the source. It's 98 degrees in the shade. And 11-year-old Josh and I watch intently as Josh's dad, Tom, writes the word smoke in grease pencil on Josh's little but surprisingly strong brown arm. There you go, buddy, Tom says, checking the timer that dangles around his neck. Smoke 'em. And Tom dashes off to time the 60-meter boys race. Josh and I sit in tiny children's folding chairs. Josh is glowing. He smiles a benevolent Buddha-like smile, watching the hordes of slick, wet swimmers jog by like two-legged seals. I ask him real offhanded, does swimming make it better? Oh yeah, Josh says, nodding. When I'm swimming, it's just all good. Nothing's bad. He grins and watches the race in front of us, nodding to some slow internal beat. Josh maybe has bipolar. It's hard to say since his brain's not done developing. In an earlier era, he would have been called a problem child, but now, despite the controversy surrounding psychiatric diagnosis and treatment of children, it's becoming likely that Josh's problem is the biological roots of his behavior. And whatever you want to call it, it looks a whole lot like the problem that drove Tom, his father, to complete his PhD in 2 years. Tom drives us back to the house, where Christine, his wife and mom to Josh and 4 other tow-headed terrors, is making dinner. Tom is no piece of cake himself, Christine will point out. At one point, she put all the kids in the car and left him. When he got off the opiates he was using to self-medicate his manias and got onto antipsychotics, she came back. Now this tight-knit family is prone to yell, Josh, in unison whenever there's the sound of a crash. Josh and I sit at the table discussing his phone. He's avoiding his mother and his meds. Under my breath, I say, Josh, I take my meds. I'm just saying. Christine comes by, holds out 1.5 Risperdal in her hand, not looking at her or at me. Josh pops them in his mouth and runs off to look at the 3 medals he won at the meet that day. As he disappears, his voice grows smaller, triumphantly calling, 3 wins for me! Every few semesters, I get to teach one of my favorite classes, which is on the history of literary journalism. Invariably, we spend the first several class sessions and much of the semester discussing subjectivity. Literary journalism as a form hinges on the belief that objective journalism is, if not strictly a mythic beast, still not the be-all and end-all of journalistic ideals. Literary journalism argues that a subjective point of view can give the reader access to insights traditional journalism cannot provide. What may be lost to the impersonal point of view, that claim of objectivity, universality, and unmediated fact, is gained in the analysis, interpretation, and contextualization that a subjective narrator can provide. As my students and I wade through the history of participatory or activist or narrative or literary journalism, whichever term you like, this is what I ask them. Does the claim of objectivity in traditional news reporting lend it a sense of authority? Does the reporter's implicit claim of authority and his use of other authorities to support his claims present an argument in favor of one view of reality over another? And if so, does that privilege one voice over others that we might hear? Point of view, perception itself, are critical considerations when it comes to any conversation about mental health. The language we use to discuss mental illness is ineffective and inexact. We have metaphors, catchphrases, figures of speech, but no net of language can gather up and hold perception, experience, and the incessant subjectivity of being a sentient self. And our minds are not overly insightful when it comes to reflecting upon our own perception. Generally, we perceive our reality as a shared reality, which contributes to the persistent faith that our opinions are fact, which in itself is a form of delusion, if not psychosis. Human beings lack a spider's prismatic vision and multifocal point of view. We are trapped in the lockbox of our minds, which is, by definition, a myopic place to be, and as a rule, it's muddled. What is mental illness like to the experiencer? It is not like LSD. It is not like Pink Floyd's The Wall. Sometimes it is like Faust and the mind is Mephistopheles. Sometimes it's like Dante and the mind is the nth circle of hell. Most often, though, it is like Kafka, an impersonal, unreachable, arbitrary, hostile administration, prone to abrupt reversals of reality and changes of rules, a randomly chosen order you are to understand is now correct. But I lack a way to say with any certainty what is wrong with me, unless it is by comparison to what is right with you. What do we call it when a person's perception of reality departs from the version of reality upon which the rest of us have agreed? When that person's mind, through an array of mechanisms we don't understand, more or less derails. In that case, I need medical language. When an individual has a condition that causes them, against their own will, to think, perceive, and behave in a way that causes them sustained suffering and harm, I can only call it disease. But there are problems with the existing models of and responses to mental health disorders. The medical, scientific, journalistic, and social constructs of mental illness share the premise that sanity must be imposed by an external observer, someone who is presumably an authority on your mind and whether it works. This observer claims the power to heal me. I am the passive consumer of the healing he sells. The power imbalance pervades the traditional psychiatric and treatment approach to mental disorder, an approach that requires and imposes isolation of the patient and demands the identification of the person's self with the sickness she is said to have. She isn't only said to have it, she is said to be it. I am bipolar. She's a schizophrenic. He's an alcoholic. He, she, it needs to be fixed. This top-down, paternalistic perception of mental illness, which pervades both the treatment and the representation of psychiatric disorders, may be these fields' most enduring flaw. The other thing we talk about in my literary journalism course is context. Generally, those of you sitting here now see me and my story out of context. Those of you on the psychiatric side of the aisle see me in the petri dish of your office, to which I dutifully report every 6 months or a year to tell you whether or not I'm being compliant and to complain that your meds are making me stupid and fat. You don't see me generally as someone who is solitary or social, left-wing or right, a hiker, a bibliophile, someone's eccentric aunt. And the journalists, you too, are prone to take me out of my actual context. I am not a wife, a cook, a daughter. I am a stereotype. I am the face of the mentally ill. My insurance won't cover my meds. I'm denied employment or housing. My services are slashed, and isn't that a shame? And while all of those things may be true, what I wonder is whether there are other stories, other angles, other voices that we're missing, and in missing them, I wonder, are we missing the point? Caleb was in a crap mood. He lay on his bed with the lights off, the blinds drawn, his hoodie up, and his arms crossed while Knucklehead Eddie, the afternoon house manager, banged on the door. It was 2 p.m., and Caleb was about 9 hours late for breakfast. Eddie started to shove the door open, but it stuck because Caleb had blocked it with 17 pairs of spotless spit-shine shoes. Eddie stuck his head in the room and looked down at the shoes. "Wow," he said. "This is really clever, man." "I'm sick of you guys busting in here and going through my stuff," Caleb replied. "I feel like a little kid." "Yeah?" Eddie said. "Well, you're acting like one. Get your ass out of bed." Caleb had arrived at what he referred to as the Flop House, New Way Treatment Center, a seriously bare-bones facility for men with mental illness and chemical dependency, courtesy of Anoka County, which had found him napping on a park bench and thrown him into detox 6 times in a week. On a hot afternoon, the cab dumped him unceremoniously on the curb in front of the collapsing Victorian that is New Way's house number 2. The heat made his nausea worse. He was just trying to find a comfortable position on the grass when, he said, he noticed these ginormous work boots coming toward his face. "I look up and here's Knucklehead Eddie looming over me," Caleb says. And he says, "Get up, buddy. I don't like bums on my lawn." Caleb laughs. "What's funny is that I was all offended. Like, where does this guy get off calling me a bum? I'm in the gutter and I'm thinking, do you know who I am?" Now, do I know Caleb's experience? No, but I know Caleb pretty well. I went to work at New Way as a mental health tech. All the residents knew I was writing about the facility and about mental illness and addiction. And while I'm certain that initially that knowledge influenced their behavior around me and generated some Baroque flourishes on the stories they told, eventually I became part of the wallpaper, one of the people who doled out their Suboxone, confiscated their contraband, and handed them plastic cups in which to pee. I'm not saying immersion is the only or even the best approach to this kind of journalism. I'm saying this was my approach to getting Caleb's side of the story. Because if I'm going to make an attempt to tell a reader about Caleb, the least I can do is try to get a closer look, not at Caleb, but from Caleb's point of view. I am an old school journalist. I believe in the role of the fourth estate. Journalism on mental health has and needs to have a purpose, one more nuanced and complex than breaking down stigma and raising awareness. Those things have to do with the way mental illness and those of us who have it are seen. Does it matter how we're seen? Yes and no. To the extent that it matters, public perception dramatically influences funding. If we are unseen, the reality of our lives and the urgency of our needs can be kept at a remove. We remain an abstraction, an issue. My concern is that for all the media's desire to cover mental health, for all the ink and airtime spent on us as an issue, we ourselves are not always seen. And true, it is not the obligation of the media to tell our stories. People's lives are not news. But if our goal is to deepen the coverage of mental health, to make it both more affecting and more accurate, we need to dig deeper than the press release, the popular wisdom, the party line. Some of the strongest journalism ever done on mental health has been ignored or dismissed out of hand, not because it's bad reporting, but because it's good. Because it has questioned assumptions, challenged assertions, chipped away at the outer crust of the issue until it hit the shifting, amorphous center that's something akin to the truth. In the introduction to his classic work of literary journalism, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, James A.G. asks his reader, "Who are you who will read these words, and through what cause, and by what chance, and for what purpose, and by what right do you qualify to, and what will you do about it?" I believe we need to be asking our readers and ourselves the same thing. I'm open to questions if people have them. Do we have time for questions? Does anyone have a question? It looks questionless. It looks question-free. True.
I have a comment. I just want to thank you. That was beautiful.
Thanks. True, joke.
I have a question around how journalists should pick individual stories. Yesterday, I saw maybe 12 patients, and the first 4 had all been on Zoloft. The first one, I think probably Zoloft saved his life. He went from not being able to make a phone call to running New York, basically. The second one had gotten agitated on Zoloft and really had had a very rough course. Another medicine had helped. The third had gained 40 pounds on Zoloft, and on and on. 4 stories of patients with the same diagnosis, with the same treatment. And based on people's implicit biases, those stories get used. The loudest stories we hear are when I make a mistake.
Right.
What doesn't get reported often are when I hit a home run.
Right.
And how are journalists supposed to sort through that, especially in this modern milieu where it feels that data in the public mind can be ambivalent about things like SSRIs? Given you can tell either story, or you could tell both stories.
Most stories, yeah.
How does a journalist do that and make a compelling piece?
I mean, there are compelling stories just in what you're saying. That story of 4 case studies, that's a 4 case study story. That's an easy story to write. It's like, and it shows the diversity. The story there, the peg is, we don't know. And if news journalists and psychiatrists would team up on the idea of we don't know a whole lot about a whole lot of things, we might get some accuracy out there. Yeah.
I agree, but when I'm in my office and someone's looking at me,
Yes.
they want me to know. And as
They
much
do
as I
want
say
me to know.
it's not so knowable, I'm going to give it my best guess, then that begins to feel to the public like, what do they say? I'm throwing darts at a bullseye.
Right.
And maybe I'll get it right.
Maybe. But the fact is, the meds we have are imprecise. And the knowledge we have is imprecise. And I think it's fine and would be better to acknowledge, here's our range of knowledge. It's a spectrum of knowledge. We can try and pinpoint spots on it that are going to be right for you, but we're just getting to like genetic assays that'll make something more effective rather than a little less effective. We really are in a fairly emerging field. And so I know your client wants you to know, but I want you to tell your client the truth. And I want the journalists to tell the reading public the truth also about what we do and don't know. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. It was just literary poetry and art and science and all in one, and my ears and soul are singing.
Oh, good. Thank you.
My question piggybacks on Drew's. So I love the ontological questions you asked, or what underlied what you spoke about in terms of the nature of reality. And I was a doctoral student here a while ago, and we are so trained to think in a post-positivist framework that there is an objective reality. And I'm a constructivist and a humanist, so I was really struggling in my program. And I'm wondering how, as you talked about, the leaders of the field being trained in these post-positive mindsets, how we can have more, case studies, subjective presentations in the clinical peer-reviewed literature and make that salient in top-tier research universities.
I would love to see more. I mean, like JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine have case studies every issue. Not all the psychiatric journals do, not all the psychological journals do, not all the social work journals do. If they did, we'd see a lot more case studies. I mean, even in the professional journals have a role where they could be providing those case studies right there in the reading that the professionals in the fields do, and getting a more diversified view of who are the clients, not just who are the clients here in New York City, but I live in Minneapolis and Nebraska. We have different clients out there. And so case studies in the public, in the professional journals, I think would really go a long way toward bringing those multiple cases and ideas and perspectives into the classroom as well. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for all your work and your books. I'm a student here in narrative medicine, diagnosed in the 90s, and your books were a huge help to me. My question is, the narrative that I often hear and that I heard back then was sort of you have to recover first, then you can do everything else. And I really feel for all the journalists in the room that there are so many stories of living in recovery with mental illness that are not being heard and not being told. I was just wondering what your perspective is on that.
I think that's so true. I think the story of living in recovery is one we don't tell. We have a narrative of disaster. We have the narrative endlessly of the train wreck girl. We have the narrative of of this figure and that figure, but we don't have a narrative of ongoingness because it lacks a news peg, because it lacks event, it lacks occasion. So like when I'm teaching nonfiction, I ask my students, what's the occasion of this essay? Why are you writing this? We do need to know that as journalists. Why am I writing this? What is newsworthy or salient about this piece? But once we know that, that story can be told. Recovery is an ongoing process. It is a series, multiple intersecting processes, biological, chemical, physiological, spiritual, all of those things can be told from different angles. And I think that's a story that has not been told yet, just the story of recovery as journey. You know what I mean? From a journalistic point of view.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. I have a question about, untold or undertold patient stories. Something we've talked about today is that there's a big problem with diversity in who becomes a patient and what patient stories get represented. And there are certain groups like communities of color or low income communities that maybe don't get to see that their stories covered in the journalism.
Right.
So I guess my question is, how do you as a journalist kind of navigate that if you want to spotlight stories that haven't traditionally been told because of stigma, or we just haven't cared, or when there's this perception that these stories aren't out there, there's not an interest in this?
I go into communities. The first, if we're specifically talking about mental health, I go to mental health community centers all the time. Like in every city I go to them. And I just talk to people, and I let people know I'm going to be there, and I'm like, I'm going to be sitting in this room for the next 9 hours. Come tell me your story. If you want, ignore me if you want. That's fine too. But that's how I gather. It's an anthropological skill. You gather stories and you find things out. But that is where the most diverse group of people with mental health concerns can be found. The most socioeconomically, ethnically, racially, and gender diverse group will be found at a place that is self-selected. A doctor's office is not self-selected ultimately. It's people who have access who go to a doctor's office. Asking doctors for sources might be useful in some cases, but ultimately you need to get out into the community. Go to Fountain House. It's down the block. They have 3,000 members. It's amazing what you'll find if you just get into the community. So,
Thank you.
thanks everybody. I really appreciate your time.